Daniel Mercer stood at the back of the county courthouse steps, watching the auctioneer wave his gavel at a crowd that had already lost interest. The man's voice echoed off empty space where bidders should have been, calling out lot numbers to an audience of tumbleweeds and dust devils. Next item, Lot 47. 63 acres of desert land, coordinates supplied. Starting bid $5. The auctioneer's voice cracked on the last word. Daniel stepped forward, his boots scraping against concrete worn smooth by decades of legal proceedings. Around him, the few remaining bidders shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact with the paperwork that described the property. Any takers? 63 acres, good for. Well, it's land, folks. An old rancher near the front shook his head. Not that land, Bill, that's bad ground. Murmurs rippled through the small crowd. Daniel caught fragments of conversation carried on the desert wind. Government land, things buried out there. Cattle won't even graze near it. The auctioneer cleared his throat. Okay, let's try $1. Silence stretched like a taut wire. Daniel felt the weight of his empty wallet. The foreclosure notice still crumpled in his truck's glove compartment. The medical bills that had consumed everything he and Sarah had saved before the fever took her. $1 might as well have been 1,000. 50 cents then. Daniel's hand rose before his mind caught up with the gesture. Here, every head turned toward him. The old rancher's face creased into something between concern and pity. Son, you don't want that land. Trust me on this. Why not? Daniel asked, though he suspected he already knew. Government land sold cheap usually came with a reason. Because smart folks stay away from places where the government used to play with things they shouldn't have, the rancher said. That desert's been empty since before I was born, and my daddy told me it was empty before him. Cattle won't go near it. Coyotes avoid it. Even the tumbleweeds seem to roll around it instead of through it. The auctioneer banged his gavel. Sold to the gentleman in the back for 50 cents. Mr. Mercer, Daniel Mercer. As Daniel signed the paperwork, accepting the deed that made him owner of 63 acres of allegedly cursed desert. The old rancher approached him with slow, deliberate steps. Name's Pete Morrison. I've been ranching this area for 42 years, and I'm telling you straight, there's something wrong with that land. My granddaddy used to tell stories about lights in the sky over that desert. Sounds that didn't belong to any animal or machine he knew. Military came through in the 50s, sealed it off for years. When they left it empty, and it stayed that way. Daniel folded the deed into his shirt pocket. Stories don't put food on the table, Mr. Morrison. Maybe not. But they keep you breathing long enough to worry about food. Morrison tipped his hat. You seem like decent folk. Just be careful out there. Some things are better left undisturbed. 3 days later, Daniel stood at the edge of his property line, watching dust devils dance across the barren landscape. The land stretched before him like an ocean of sand and scattered sage, broken only by the occasional bleached bone of some long-dead animal. The deed in his pocket described it as unimproved desert acreage with mineral rights, but Daniel suspected that if there had been any valuable minerals here, the government wouldn't have let it go for 50 cents. The morning sun painted everything in shades of amber and rust. Daniel walked the perimeter, marking corners with stakes he'd bought from his last $20, trying to convince himself he'd made a reasonable investment. Maybe the land would be worth something to a solar company. Maybe a developer would want it for a housing project that wouldn't materialize for 20 years. Maybe he could at least build a small trailer here and avoid rent while he figured out what came next. That's when the storm hit. It came from nowhere. A wall of sand and wind that turned day into twilight in minutes. Daniel had seen desert storms before during his deployment overseas, but this one felt different. The wind carried an electric charge that made his skin crawl, and the sand stung like needles against exposed flesh. He took shelter behind a cluster of boulders, pulling his jacket over his head while the storm raged with unusual violence. When it passed, 30 minutes later, the landscape had changed. The wind had scoured away years of accumulated sand and debris, revealing shapes that hadn't seen sunlight in decades. Daniel walked slowly across the transformed terrain. noting how the storm seemed to have followed deliberate patterns, as if it knew exactly what to uncover. That's when he found the first sign, half buried in sand that had been packed hard by rain and wind. A metal plate emerged from the ground like a metallic flower. Daniel knelt beside it, brushing away grit and pebbles, until he could read the faded stenciled letters. Authorized personnel only, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Below the warning, smaller text that had been partially scraped away by decades of sandstorms. Project E, restricted area. Violation of federal offense. Daniel's hands moved faster now, clearing more sand from around the sign. Beneath it, barely visible, lay the outline of something larger. Metal edges, straight and deliberate, formed the outline of what could only be a hatch. The lock was a massive thing, built to last and designed to keep people out. But 40 years of desert weather had done what bolt cutters might have struggled with. The metal had corroded just enough to show weakness at the joints. Daniel ran his fingers along the edges, feeling how the constant expansion and contraction of temperature extremes had loosened the seal. This wasn't just buried junk. This was military infrastructure, hidden and abandoned. The kind of thing that might justify the locals' superstitious avoidance of the area. Daniel stood, brushing sand from his knees, and looked across his property with new eyes. If there was one hatch, there might be others. If the military had built something here substantial enough to require warning signs and heavy locks, they'd built it to last. And if they'd abandoned it completely, well, that's when things got interesting. He spent the rest of the day walking systematic grid patterns across his 63 acres, looking for other signs of buried infrastructure. By evening, he'd found 2 more corroded signs, and what appeared to be a concrete foundation buried under decades of accumulated sand. Whatever had been built here, it had been substantial. The old ranches, warnings about cursed ground suddenly seemed less like superstition and more like practical advice. Daniel found Evelyn Ross exactly where the librarian had said he would, in the basement of the Ridgefield Historical Society, surrounded by towers of manila folders and boxes labeled with dates spanning 6 decades. She looked up from a magnifying glass positioned over a faded photograph, squinting at him through wire-rimmed glasses that had seen better years. "You're the one who bought the Morrison land," she said, before he could introduce himself. It wasn't a question. Word travels fast in small towns. Daniel removed his hat, noting how the basement smelled of old paper and preservation chemicals. Word travels especially fast when someone buys land that's been sitting empty for 43 years. Evelyn Ross was smaller than he'd expected, maybe 60 years old, with grey hair pulled back in a practical bun, and clothes that suggested she spent more time thinking about the past than worrying about fashion. "I'm Evelyn. You're Daniel Mercer, recently widowed veteran, desperate enough to buy desert land for pocket change." Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "The librarian said you might know something about the history of that area." The librarian was being diplomatic. Evelyn stood, moving to a filing cabinet with the efficiency of someone who knew exactly where everything was located. "What she meant was that I'm the crazy lady who's spent 30 years chasing conspiracy theories about Cold War experiments that officially never happened." She pulled out a thick folder and spread its contents across a table cleared for the purpose. Photographs, photocopied documents, newspaper clippings, and hand-drawn maps covered every available surface. "Project Echo," she said, pointing to a barely visible stamp on what appeared to be a military requisition form. Officially, it never existed. Unofficially, it was one of about 40 different programs the military ran during the 50s and 60s, trying to develop new forms of communication and surveillance technology. Daniel leaned over the table, studying the documents. Most were heavily redacted, with entire paragraphs blacked out by government censors. But enough remained visible to paint a disturbing picture. "They were experimenting with frequency manipulation," Evelyn continued. "Radio waves, electromagnetic fields, possibly even weather modification. The theory was that if they could control communication frequencies, they could disrupt enemy coordination without traditional warfare. And they built this facility on my land. Your land and about 2,000 acres surrounding it that the government quietly purchased between 1952 and 1954. Evelyn pointed to a map that showed Daniel's property as a small square within a much larger restricted area. Most of that land has been sold back to private owners over the years, but always in small pieces and always to people who don't ask too many questions. Daniel studied the map more carefully. What happened to the project? That's where the official record gets creative. Evelyn pulled out a newspaper clipping from 1963. The headline read, "Military training exercise concluded at area facility." The article was 3 sentences long and revealed nothing. But the local records tell a different story, she continued, spreading out more documents. Emergency services calls, strange weather patterns, livestock deaths, and then suddenly nothing. The military packed up and left in the middle of the night, sealed everything underground, and pretended it never happened. Daniel picked up one of the photographs, a black and white aerial shot that showed his land before it became desert wasteland. Structures were visible, buildings, roads, what appeared to be substantial infrastructure. How much of this do you believe? Evelyn met his gaze directly. 3 months ago, I would have said I believed about 60% of it. Enough to keep researching, not enough to stake my reputation on it. But then you went and bought that land, and Pete Morrison called me within an hour to warn me that someone was finally going to go digging around out there. Morrison called you? Pete's grandfather used to work for the project. Pembley's been keeping quiet about it for 60 years, but they've also been keeping watch, making sure nobody got too curious about what's buried out there. Evelyn began gathering the documents. The question is, Mr. Mercer, what exactly did you find that made you come looking for answers? Daniel described the hatch, the warning signs, the foundation hidden beneath decades of sand. As he spoke, Evelyn's expression shifted from skeptical interest to genuine concern. You haven't tried to open anything yet, have you? Not yet, but I was planning. Don't. The sharpness in her voice surprised him. Not alone, and not without understanding what you're dealing with. If even half of what I've documented is true, Project Echo wasn't shut down because it was unsuccessful. It was shut down because it worked too well. She handed him a photocopied page from what appeared to be a military incident report. Most of it was redacted, but one line remained visible. Containment breach resulted in immediate evacuation of all personnel. Recommend permanent site abandonment and classification upgrade. Whatever they were doing out there, Evelyn said, they lost control of it. And when the military loses control of something, they usually bury it deep and walk away. Daniel folded the incident report and slipped it into his jacket pocket alongside the deed that had started everything. So what do you recommend? I recommend we work together. You need someone who understands what you're likely to find down there. I need someone with legal access to the site and the practical skills to get underground. Evelyn extended her hand. Partners? Daniel shook it, noting the firmness of her grip and the calluses that suggested she was more than just a researcher. Partners. But we do this carefully? Agreed. Because if I'm right about Project Echo, careful might be the only thing that keeps us alive. Daniel returned to the site at dawn, carrying tools borrowed from Morrison's ranch and a flashlight that Evelyn had insisted was military-grade. The old rancher had handed over the equipment without questions, but his expression carried the weight of someone who expected to never see either the tools or Daniel again. Remember what I told you about some things being better left alone, Morrison had said, loading the crowbar and bolt cutters into Daniel's truck. Whatever you find down there, it's been sealed up for a reason. Now, standing over the corroded hatch with morning shadows stretching across the desert, Daniel wondered if Morrison's warnings carried more weight than superstition. The metal surface was cold despite the warming sun, and up close, the warning stencils were more ominous than official. Someone had spray-painted additional warnings in red letters that had faded to rust brown. Danger, toxic materials, and authorized entry only. Evelyn arrived as Daniel was testing the lock mechanism with a pair of wire cutters. She carried a canvas bag that clinked with metal tools and what sounded like electronic equipment. Geiger counter, she explained, noting his curious glance at the bag. If they were experimenting with radioactive materials, you think they were? I think we should assume the worst and hope for better. She knelt beside the hatch, examining the lock more closely. This corrosion is interesting. See how it's concentrated around the locking mechanism? Almost like something from inside was eating away at the metal. Daniel positioned the crowbar against the lock housing, feeling decades of rust flake away under pressure. The mechanism was substantial, built to military specifications, but 40 years of desert weather had found every weakness in the steel. When the lock finally gave way, it did so with a grinding shriek that echoed across the empty landscape. The hatch opened on hinges that protested with metallic groans. Below, a shaft descended into darkness that seemed to swallow Daniel's flashlight beam. The air that rose from the opening carried scents of rust, chemicals, and something organic that had been sealed away for decades. Emergency lighting, Evelyn observed, pointing to fixtures mounted along the shaft walls. Probably battery-powered backup systems. Daniel lowered himself through the opening first, testing each rung of the metal ladder bolted to the shaft wall. 15 feet down, his boots touched solid concrete. He called up to Evelyn, and she descended with careful precision, her own flashlight adding to the weak illumination. They found themselves in a corridor lined with metal doors, each marked with faded stencils, communications, storage, restricted access. The emergency lights flickered weakly, powered by some backup system that had somehow survived 4 decades of abandonment. Incredible, Evelyn whispered, running her fingers along walls lined with cables and conduits. This place is huge, much bigger than anything in the official records. Daniel examined the nearest door, finding it unlocked but difficult to open. The handle turned with effort, revealing a room filled with electronic equipment that looked like something from a science fiction movie of the 1950s. Massive vacuum tubes, banks of switches and dials, and display screens dark with age. Communication equipment, he said, recognizing some components from his military training, but not like anything standard issue. This is custom built. They moved deeper into the facility, finding room after room of abandoned equipment. Some doors were sealed with warning tape that had degraded into brittle strips. Others stood open, revealing laboratories with equipment Daniel couldn't identify, and workbenches covered with instruments that seemed designed for purposes beyond normal military applications. "Look at this," Evelyn called from across the corridor. Daniel joined her in front of a room marked "Frequency Modulation, Authorized Personnel Only." Inside, banks of equipment lined the walls around a central console that looked like the control center for a radio station. But the components were far more complex than any broadcast equipment Daniel had seen. Crystalline structures were mounted in metal housing, connected by cables to amplifiers and modulation devices that hummed faintly with residual power. "It's still active," he realized, noting indicator lights that glowed dimly on several panels. "The whole facility is still powered," Evelyn confirmed, checking a wall-mounted gauge. Emergency generators, probably running on some kind of fuel cell system designed to last indefinitely. They continued their exploration, mapping the facility room by room. The layout was larger and more complex than either had expected. Corridors branched in multiple directions, connecting laboratories, storage areas, living quarters, and rooms whose purpose remained unclear. At the far end of the main corridor, they found what had stopped them both cold, a heavy door, reinforced with steel plates and sealed with welding that looked recent compared to the facility's obvious age. Warning signs covered every available surface. and someone had painted "Do Not Open" in letters large enough to be visible from across the corridor. This wasn't sealed when the military abandoned the place, Daniel observed, examining the welding work. Someone came back and sealed this room after the original evacuation. Or someone never left, Evelyn suggested quietly. The welded seams were crude but effective, clearly done with portable equipment under emergency conditions. Daniel ran his fingers along the metalwork, feeling heat damage that suggested whoever had done the welding had been working fast, possibly under extreme stress, whatever they were trying to keep contained in there, he said. They were desperate enough to seal themselves out of it permanently. They made camp that night in one of the facility's former quarters, a room with 2 metal cots and a small table that had somehow remained intact through decades of abandonment. Daniel had brought sleeping bags and supplies. Planning to spend several days exploring the underground complex thoroughly, Evelyn spread her research materials across the table, cross-referencing the facility's layout with the fragmentary documents she'd collected over 30 years of investigation. According to this requisition log, she said, pointing to a photocopied form, they brought in equipment for something called atmospheric frequency manipulation. And look at this shipping manifest: crystalline resonators, electromagnetic field generators, and something listed only as Project Echo primary components. Daniel studied the documents while monitoring the Geiger counter, which had remained mercifully quiet throughout their exploration. What do you think they were actually doing down here? Best guess. They were trying to develop a weapon that could disrupt enemy communications without conventional attack. Radio jamming taken to an extreme level, possibly including the ability to interfere with radar, telephone systems, even electrical grids. That doesn't sound impossible. Military's been working on electronic warfare since World War II. True, but look at these incident reports. Evelyn pulled out a stack of forms marked with dates spanning several months. Equipment malfunctions, unexplained power fluctuations, personnel reporting headaches and disorientation. And then this, a meteorological report showing localized weather disturbances directly above the facility. Daniel examined the weather data. The reports described sudden temperature changes, isolated storms, and atmospheric pressure variations that occurred only in the immediate area above the underground complex. They weren't just jamming radio signals, he realized. They were affecting the atmosphere itself. That's when the problems started. Evelyn pointed to the final incident reports, heavily redacted, but clearly describing some kind of emergency. Equipment overload, facility evacuation, and then that final classification change that buried the whole project. They were interrupted by a sound that made them both freeze. A low vibration, felt more than heard, seemed to emanate from deep within the facility. It lasted only seconds, but it was followed by a subtle change in the air pressure that made their ears pop. Emergency generators cycling, Daniel suggested, though his hand had automatically moved to the pistol he'd started carrying since finding the facility. The vibration came again, stronger this time, accompanied by a faint harmonic tone that seemed to resonate through the metal walls. The emergency lighting flickered, and several pieces of abandoned equipment briefly lit up with indicator lights before falling dark again. "That's not mechanical," Evelyn said quietly. "That's the facility's primary systems responding to something." They gathered their equipment and moved cautiously toward the sealed room at the end of the main corridor. The vibrations were stronger here, and the harmonic tone was clearly audible, a low, thrumming note that seemed to pulse in regular intervals. "It's coming from behind that door," Daniel confirmed, pressing his ear to the welded metal. "Something in there is still active." Evelyn checked her research materials, finding a floor plan that showed the sealed room as significantly larger than the others, with multiple power connections and what appeared to be substantial ventilation systems. According to this schematic, that room was the heart of Project Echo, the main experimental chamber. The harmonic tone shifted, rising in pitch and intensity until it became uncomfortably loud. Both Daniel and Evelyn stepped back from the door as the entire facility seemed to shudder around them. Emergency lights throughout the corridor blazed to full brightness before dimming again. "Whatever they sealed in there," Daniel said, "it's still running. After 40 years, it's still operational and getting stronger," Evelyn added, noting how the indicator lights on nearby equipment panels were now glowing steadily instead of flickering. "The whole facility is drawing more power." The vibrations subsided gradually, leaving them in relative quiet that somehow felt more ominous than the disturbance itself. In the distance, they could hear sounds that might have been mechanical systems activating, or might have been something else entirely. "We need to understand what we're dealing with before we go any further," Evelyn said. "If Project Echo was shut down because of a containment breach, and if something in that room is still active, then opening that door might be the worst decision we could make," Daniel finished. "But it might also be the only way to find out what we're really sitting on top of." They returned to their temporary camp to plan their next move. But sleep was difficult with the facility humming around them like a living thing, powered by systems that should have died decades ago but instead seemed to be awakening after a long dormancy. Daniel woke to the sound of engines echoing across the desert. Through the hatch opening above, he could see dust clouds approaching from the east, multiple vehicles moving fast across the flat terrain. His military instincts kicked in immediately. 3 trucks, probably 4-wheel drive, loaded with more people than any legitimate desert expedition would require. "Evelyn," he shook her awake, noting how the facility's constant humming had continued through the night. "We've got company." She came alert quickly, gathering her research materials, while Daniel climbed the ladder to observe the approaching vehicles. Through the hatch opening, he counted 8 men emerging from trucks that looked like they'd been modified for desert scavenging. Reinforced bumpers, extra fuel tanks, and equipment racks loaded with metal detectors and excavation tools. The man directing the others was lean and sun-weathered, with the kind of scars that came from years of dangerous work in unforgiving environments. He moved with the casual authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "That's the government land Morrison was talking about," the leader called to his crew, pointing toward the open hatch. "Looks like someone beat us to it," Daniel cursed silently. The open hatch was visible from a considerable distance, and their trucks were parked nearby. There was no way to conceal their presence or pretend the facility was still sealed. "Troy Dust Kavanaugh," Evelyn whispered, having climbed the ladder to observe beside him. "Local reputation for salvaging anything valuable from abandoned properties. He's not particularly concerned with legal niceties." "How do you know him?" "He tried to break into the Historical Society last year, looking for maps of old mining claims. The kind of man who believes everything valuable should belong to whoever's willing to take it." Daniel watched the scavenger crew deploy around the hatch with practiced efficiency. They'd done this before, and they weren't planning to negotiate for access to whatever lay beneath the desert. "You folks down there need to come up and have a conversation," Kavanaugh called down the shaft. His voice carried the tone of someone making a polite request while holding all the leverage. "We can do this friendly, or we can do it the hard way." Daniel checked his pistol, knowing it wouldn't be much use against 8 men with superior position and heavier weapons. He could see rifle barrels among the equipment they'd unloaded from their trucks. "What do you want?" he called back. "Simple business proposition. You found something interesting, we want to share in the profits. Government land's been sitting empty for 40 years because it's full of valuable salvage. We figure there's enough for everyone." Evelyn moved to the corridor behind the ladder, gathering equipment and documents into her bag. Daniel could see her thinking through options, calculating risks and possibilities. "The thing is," Kavanaugh continued, "we heard rumors about this place our whole lives. Stories about government experiments, classified equipment, maybe even precious metals buried down there. When we saw your trucks and that open hatch, we figured it was time to investigate. And if we're not interested in sharing? Kavanaugh's laugh echoed down the shaft with unpleasant implications. Then we wait you out. Desert's a harsh place. Man can die of thirst in 2 days if he's not careful. Accidents happen all the time out here. Daniel weighed their options quickly. The facility had multiple corridors and rooms that could provide cover, but they'd be trapped underground with limited supplies. On the surface, they'd be outnumbered and outgunned by men who clearly had experience with violent confrontation. "Give us a few minutes to gather our things," Daniel called up. "Take your time. We're patient folk." Daniel turned to Evelyn, speaking quietly. "The sealed room at the end of the corridor. Is there another way out through there?" "The schematics show ventilation shafts, but they might not be large enough for people." She studied the floor plans again. "There's also what looks like a secondary access tunnel, but I can't tell where it leads. Better than being sitting ducks down here." Daniel began moving their essential supplies toward the back of the facility. "If we can reach that sealed room and find another exit, we'd have to cut through the welding first. That could take hours. Then we better get started." They moved quickly through the facility, carrying tools and supplies toward the sealed chamber. Behind them, they could hear Kavanaugh's crew starting to descend the ladder, no longer willing to wait for voluntary compliance. "Beginning to think we overstayed our welcome," one of the scavengers said, his voice echoing through the corridors. "Probably figured we'd give up and go home," another replied. "Folks always underestimate how motivated we get when there's money involved." Daniel reached the sealed door first, setting down their equipment and examining the welded seams more carefully. The metalwork would yield to the right tools, but it would require time they didn't have, a noise that would alert the scavengers to their location, unless the facility's increasing activity provided the distraction they needed. The harmonic tone was stronger now, pulsing with a rhythm that seemed almost deliberate. As Daniel set up the cutting torch he'd brought from Morrison's ranch, the facility's emergency lighting began cycling through brightness levels that followed the same rhythm as the sounds from behind the sealed door. "Whatever's in there is responding to our presence," Evelyn observed. "Or maybe to the additional people in the facility." "Let's hope it's feeling helpful," Daniel said, igniting the torch and beginning to cut through the decades-old welding that had sealed away the heart of Project Echo. The cutting torch was halfway through its work when the gunshots started above ground. Not the controlled reports of warning shots, but the rapid exchange of automatic weapons, followed by shouting that carried a note of genuine panic. Daniel shut off the torch, straining to hear what was happening on the surface. The scavengers in the facility had gone silent, their casual conversation replaced by the tense whispers of men who suddenly found themselves outmatched. "Military vehicles approaching from the west," came Kavanaugh's voice, tight with controlled fear. "At least 3 Humvees, maybe more. Moving fast." Evelyn met Daniel's eyes in the flickering emergency lighting. "The government? Somebody with better equipment than desert scavengers," Daniel replied, checking his watch. They'd been underground for 18 hours, long enough for someone to notice unusual activity at a site that was supposed to remain buried. The facility's harmonic tone shifted again, rising to a pitch that made their teeth ache. Around them, abandoned equipment came alive with indicator lights and display screens that hadn't functioned in decades. Whatever was sealed behind the welded door was responding to the presence of additional people above ground. Heavy boots echoed down the access shaft, moving with military precision that was distinctly different from the scavengers' earlier descent. Daniel recognized the sound, soldiers who knew how to move quickly without sacrificing tactical awareness. "Civilian personnel in the facility," a voice called from the main corridor. The tone carried absolute authority, backed by the confidence of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. "You have 60 seconds to identify yourselves and report to the main entry point." Daniel grabbed Evelyn's arm, pulling her toward the partially cut door. "We're not dealing with federal agents conducting a routine investigation." "That's military command voice. How can you tell?" Because I've heard it before. Usually right before things go very bad very quickly. The cutting torch had penetrated most of the welded seam, leaving only a small section that might yield to physical pressure. Daniel positioned the crowbar against the weakened metal, applying leverage while Evelyn gathered their essential documents and equipment. The sealed door gave way with a shriek of tortured metal that echoed through the facility like a scream. Beyond lay a chamber that dwarfed everything they'd seen so far, a vast space filled with equipment that belonged in a science fiction movie rather than a 1960s military facility. Jesus Christ, Daniel whispered. The central feature was a machine that rose 3 stories through the chamber, its crystalline components pulsing with energy that cast shifting patterns of light across walls, lined with control panels and monitoring equipment. Massive cables snaked across the floor, connecting the primary device to auxiliary systems that hummed with barely contained power. But it was the man, standing beside the central console, who made both Daniel and Evelyn freeze in the doorway. Colonel Raymond. Harker looked exactly like what central casting would order for a military villain. Tall, silver-haired, wearing a crisp uniform that somehow remained immaculate despite the desert environment. His eyes held the cold calculation of someone who'd spent decades making decisions that cost other people everything. "Mr. Daniel Mercer," Harker said, consulting a tablet that displayed what appeared to be a complete military service record. "Former Army mechanic, deployed to Afghanistan 2019 to 2021. Lost your brother Marcus during a classified operation that you were never fully briefed about." Daniel's hand moved toward his pistol, stopping when he noticed the armed soldiers positioned around the chamber's perimeter. 6 men in full combat gear, carrying weapons that could cut him down before he cleared leather. "And Dr. Evelyn Ross," Harker continued, turning his attention to the historian. 30 years of unauthorized research into classified military programs. We've been monitoring your activities for quite some time, waiting to see if you'd ever get close enough to anything significant to warrant intervention." "This facility was abandoned," Evelyn said, though her voice carried less conviction than her words suggested. "The land was sold at public auction." Harker smiled, with the warmth of winter sunlight on steel. "The land was sold. The contents of what lies beneath it remain classified property of the United States government. Property that you've now accessed without authorization." Daniel studied the massive machine, noting details that stirred memories from his military service. Components that looked familiar, design elements that suggested purposes beyond simple communication equipment. "You're the officer who ran Project Echo," he said, pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. "You were here when they shut it down." "I was the project director, yes. And I was responsible for ensuring that certain dangerous technologies remained safely contained when the decision was made to suspend operations." Harker moved to the central console, his fingers dancing across controls that responded with cascades of light through the crystalline structures. "What we developed here was revolutionary. The ability to manipulate electromagnetic frequencies on a scale that could disrupt enemy communications across entire continents." The machine's harmonic tone shifted again, and Daniel felt the change as much as heard it. The air itself seemed to thicken, pressing against his eardrums with a pressure that made thinking difficult. "But like many revolutionary technologies," Harker continued, "it proved to have applications beyond our original intentions. Weather modification, atmospheric manipulation, even the potential to influence human neural activity through precisely controlled electromagnetic fields." Evelyn's research materials scattered as she stumbled, one hand pressed to her forehead. "The headaches, the personnel reports, side effects of prolonged exposure to the field generators," Harker confirmed. "We learned to compensate, to work with the technology rather than fighting its influence. But the decision was made at levels above my authority to classify the entire project beyond top secret and seal the facility permanently." Daniel, forced himself to focus, despite the pressure building behind his eyes. "So what changed? Why come back now?" "Because, Mr. Mercer, your brother's final mission was an attempt to locate and destroy similar technology that had fallen into enemy hands. Technology that was based on stolen Project Echo research." Harker's expression remained impassive, but something colder entered his voice. "He died because I wasn't permitted to provide him with the information that might have kept him alive." The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. His brother's death, the classified mission that had gone wrong, the official reports that revealed nothing about why Marcus had been sent into a situation that killed his entire unit, all connected to the machine that now hummed with malevolent energy in the chamber around them. "You killed him," Daniel said, his voice barely controlled. "I killed him by following orders to keep Project Echo buried instead of using it to protect our people in the field." Harker turned back to the control console, making adjustments that caused the machine's output to stabilize at a level that allowed normal thought. But circumstances have changed. Enemy nations have developed their own versions of this technology, and the balance of power has shifted in ways that threaten American interests worldwide. "So, you're reactivating the project." "I'm completing what we started 40 years ago. With modern computer systems and advanced materials, Project Echo can be refined into something far more powerful than the original design." Harker gestured toward monitors displaying global communication networks, weather patterns and electromagnetic field maps. The ability to disrupt enemy infrastructure without conventional warfare, to control information flow across entire populations, to influence weather patterns that could cripple hostile nations economically. Daniel looked around the chamber, noting additional equipment that hadn't been there during the original project: modern computers, satellite uplinks, and control systems that suggested Harker had been preparing for this moment for years. The scavengers outside, eliminated, they were unfortunate witnesses to a classified operation. Harker's tone carried no more emotion than if he'd been discussing the weather. "You and Dr. Ross present a more complex problem. Your knowledge of the facility and its capabilities makes you security risks. But your expertise could also prove valuable." The machine's harmonic tone rose again, and Daniel felt the pressure return with interest. This time, however, he noticed something else, a resonance that seemed to echo from deeper within the facility, as if the main chamber housed only part of a much larger system. "There's more," he realized. "This isn't the complete installation." Harker nodded approvingly. "Very good. The main facility extends much deeper, with primary generators and core control systems located in chambers that were sealed even from most project personnel. What you're seeing here is merely the interface level. How deep does it go? Deep enough to tap into geothermal energy sources that can power the system indefinitely. Deep enough to house resonance chambers capable of generating electromagnetic fields that can be detected from orbit." Harker made additional adjustments to the control panel, and the chamber filled with a subsonic vibration that Daniel felt in his bones. Deep enough to ensure that Project Echo can operate independently of any external power source or governmental oversight. The implications hit both Daniel and Evelyn simultaneously. This wasn't a government operation being reactivated under official authority. This was a rogue military officer with access to technology that could influence global communications and weather patterns, operating without oversight or accountability. "You're planning to use this against the United States," Evelyn said. "I'm planning to use this for the United States," Harker corrected, "but not necessarily with the approval of politicians who lack the vision to understand what's at stake in the modern world." Daniel calculated distances and angles, noting the positions of Harker's soldiers and the locations of potential cover. The odds were impossibly bad, but the alternative was allowing a madman access to technology that could reshape global politics through electromagnetic manipulation. "Your brother understood duty. Mr. Mercer, He died because bureaucrats refused to provide him with the tools necessary to complete his mission successfully. Harker's voice carried genuine emotion for the first time. I'm offering you the chance to honor his sacrifice by helping to ensure that no other American soldiers die, because their government was too cautious to use the weapons at its disposal. The machine's output surged again, and this time Daniel felt something different in the electromagnetic field, a resonance that seemed to echo his own heartbeat, a frequency that made him want to agree with whatever Harker suggested. That's when he understood the true horror of Project Echo. It wasn't just a communication weapon or a weather modification system. It was a device capable of influencing human consciousness through precisely controlled electromagnetic fields. A technology that could make people believe whatever the operator wanted them to believe, and Colonel Harker had just demonstrated its effectiveness on both of them. The realization that Project Echo was influencing their thoughts hit Daniel like cold water, cutting through the electromagnetic haze that had been clouding his judgment. He grabbed Evelyn's arm, squeezing hard enough to get her attention without alerting Harker's soldiers. The frequency modulation, he whispered, barely audible over the machine's harmonic output. It's affecting our neural activity. Evelyn's eyes cleared as she fought to focus past the artificial influence. Her research had documented personnel reports of headaches and disorientation, but experiencing the technology firsthand revealed its true purpose. Project Echo wasn't just designed to disrupt enemy communications. It was built to control human consciousness on a massive scale. Remarkable, isn't it? Harker said, having noticed their moment of clarity. The original project stumbled onto the neural influence capabilities almost by accident. We were trying to develop more effective jamming frequencies when we discovered that certain electromagnetic patterns could influence brainwave activity directly. He made adjustments to the control panel, and Daniel felt the pressure in his skull increase to almost unbearable levels. Around the chamber, monitoring equipment displayed real-time brain activity readings, their brain activity, transmitted through the electromagnetic field and displayed on screens that showed how their neural patterns were being influenced by the machine's output. The applications are limitless, Harker continued, his voice taking on the enthusiasm of a researcher discussing a favorite project. Crowd control without violence, interrogation without physical coercion, the ability to influence political decisions by subtly adjusting the thought patterns of key individuals. You're talking about mind control, Evelyn managed, fighting to form coherent words against the electromagnetic pressure. I'm talking about precision influence, Dr. Ross, the ability to nudge human consciousness toward desired outcomes without the crude manipulation techniques that have characterized psychological warfare for centuries. Harker gestured toward additional displays showing global communication networks. Imagine being able to influence the thought patterns of enemy leaders during critical negotiations, or ensuring that hostile populations remain docile during occupation operations. Daniel studied the chamber more carefully, noting details that his military training helped him interpret despite the electromagnetic interference. The machine was impressive, but it was also complex, dependent on precise calibration and multiple interconnected systems that could potentially be disrupted if someone knew which components to target. The deeper levels you mentioned, he said, struggling to maintain focus. That's where the primary control systems are located? The core chambers house the main resonance generators and the geothermal power taps that allow the system to operate independently of external energy sources. Harker pulled up a schematic that showed the facility extending hundreds of feet underground, with chambers carved into solid rock and cooling systems that drew energy from underground thermal sources. 40 years of technological advancement has allowed us to refine the original design into something far more powerful than the equipment you see here. The schematic revealed something that made Daniel's blood run cold. The facility wasn't just larger than they'd imagined. It was connected to a network of similar installations across the southwestern United States, each one capable of generating electromagnetic fields that could influence human consciousness across entire metropolitan areas. Multiple sites, Evelyn observed, her historian's eye catching details that painted a terrifying picture. You've been building this network for decades, since the original project was officially terminated, yes, using classified funding and personnel who understood the strategic importance of maintaining America's technological superiority. Harker's expression carried the satisfaction of someone whose long-term planning was finally bearing fruit. What you've discovered here is the command center for a system that can influence human behavior across most of the continental United States. Daniel felt the electromagnetic field shift again, this time carrying a frequency that made him want to admire Harker's vision, to see the military applications as necessary for national security. He bit down hard on his tongue, using physical pain to maintain mental clarity. The neural influence works both ways, he realized. Extended exposure affects the operators as well as the targets, an unfortunate side effect that we've learned to manage through careful exposure protocols and mental conditioning techniques. Harker made additional adjustments to the control panel, and the chamber filled with a subsonic vibration that seemed to resonate through Daniel's entire skeleton. The benefits far outweigh the risks, particularly for personnel who understand the strategic importance of the mission. Around the chamber, Harker's soldiers remained at their positions with the mechanical precision of men whose thoughts had been influenced by prolonged exposure to the electromagnetic fields. Their eyes held the glassy focus of people who no longer questioned orders because they'd lost the ability to think independently. "You've turned your own men into puppets," Evelyn said. "I've eliminated the psychological factors that interfere with military efficiency," Harker corrected. "Fear, doubt, moral hesitation, all obstacles to effective combat performance that can be minimized through precise electromagnetic conditioning." Daniel studied the soldiers more carefully, noting details that his military experience helped him interpret. They were positioned according to standard defensive protocols, but their movements had the slightly artificial quality of people operating under external influence. More importantly, they were focused on threats from outside the chamber rather than watching their captives closely. The machine's harmonic output shifted again, and this time Daniel felt something different in the electromagnetic field, a resonance that seemed to be building towards some kind of crescendo. Around the chamber, monitoring equipment displayed increasing power, levels and frequency patterns that were climbing toward parameters marked with warning indicators. "You're bringing the system to full operational capacity," he said. "The initial test phase, yes. We need to verify that the modern upgrades have integrated properly with the original Project Echo infrastructure." Harker consulted readouts that showed power levels approaching maximum capacity. "Once we've confirmed system stability, we can begin Phase 2 operations, which involves selective influence campaigns designed to eliminate political opposition to military action in targeted regions overseas. Congressional representatives who've been blocking defense appropriations will find themselves more receptive to national security arguments. Media personalities who've been critical of military interventions will discover renewed patriotic enthusiasm." The electromagnetic field was reaching levels that made normal thought almost impossible. Daniel felt his resistance to Harker's suggestions weakening as the machine's output approached maximum intensity. Around him, monitoring equipment displayed brain activity patterns that showed how the electromagnetic fields were synchronizing neural activity across everyone in the chamber. But maximum intensity also meant maximum power draw from the system's primary generators. And Daniel's mechanical training had taught him that any system operating at peak capacity was also at its most vulnerable to catastrophic failure. "The geothermal power taps," he said, fighting to form words against the electromagnetic pressure. "If they're drawing maximum energy to power the system, they're operating well within safe parameters," Harker assured him, though Daniel noticed the colonel consulting monitoring equipment with slightly more concern than his confident tone suggested. "Unless someone disrupted the cooling systems," Daniel continued, understanding flooding through his mind despite the electromagnetic interference. "Geothermal power sources require precise temperature management. If the cooling systems failed while the generators were operating at maximum capacity," Harker's expression shifted from confidence to alarm as he realized the implications. A catastrophic failure at maximum. Power levels wouldn't just destroy the facility. It would release electromagnetic energy that could disrupt communications and electrical systems across hundreds of miles. "The cooling systems are automated and redundant," Harker said, but his voice carried less certainty than his words suggested. "Automated systems that have been running for 40 years without maintenance," Daniel pointed out. "Operating equipment that was designed in the 1960s and jury-rigged with modern components." Around the chamber, warning indicators began flashing on monitoring equipment as the system's power draw approached levels that stressed components beyond their design specifications. The machine's harmonic output was becoming erratic, shifting between frequencies in patterns that caused the electromagnetic field to fluctuate wildly. And deep beneath the facility, something was beginning to go very wrong. The first sign of catastrophic failure was a sound that had no place in any machine designed by human engineers, a screaming harmonic that rose through octaves until it became physically painful. Around the chamber, monitoring equipment erupted in cascades of warning lights, while display screens showed system parameters climbing into ranges marked with red warning zones. "Emergency shutdown protocols," Harker barked to his soldiers, but their electromagnetic conditioning worked against them now. The men who'd lost the ability to think independently couldn't adapt to rapidly changing circumstances that required initiative and quick decision-making. Daniel felt the electromagnetic field fluctuating wildly, alternating between crushing pressure and sudden absence that left his thoughts spinning. Beside him, Evelyn was struggling to remain conscious as neural influence frequencies shifted randomly across the spectrum. "The core systems are overloading," she managed, pointing to displays that showed geothermal power levels climbing beyond safe operating parameters. "If the cooling systems can't handle the thermal output, the entire facility becomes a massive electromagnetic pulse generator," Daniel finished, understanding the implications with mechanical clarity that cut through the fluctuating field influence. "Every electronic system within hundreds of miles gets fried, but there was something worse than an electromagnetic pulse." The displays showed resonance patterns that suggested the geothermal taps were creating positive feedback loops with underground thermal sources. Project Echo wasn't just overloading, it was triggering geological instability that could affect the entire region. The chamber shuddered as if the earth itself was protesting the machine's operation. Dust rained from ceiling fixtures, while the central crystalline structure began to glow with energy that was clearly beyond its design specifications. "Sir," one of Harker's soldiers called, his electromagnetic conditioning apparently insufficient to prevent basic survival instincts. "Structural damage to the upper levels? The facility is compromising." Through the chamber's observation windows, Daniel could see emergency lighting flickering throughout the complex as power systems struggled to handle energy loads they'd never been designed to accommodate. In the distance, the sounds of metal stress and rock fracture suggested that the underground complex was literally tearing itself apart. "This is what happened before," Evelyn said, her voice cutting through the chaos with sudden clarity. "The original containment breach. They lost control of the system, and it nearly destroyed everything within 50 miles. Harker was working frantically at the control console, trying to initiate shutdown procedures that should have been automatic but apparently required manual intervention when the system was operating beyond safe parameters. The automated systems are failing, he admitted, his military composure cracking as he realized the scope of the disaster he'd initiated. Manual shutdown requires access to the core control chambers, the deep levels you mentioned earlier, Daniel said. 300 feet underground, accessible only through maintenance shafts that were designed to be sealed during emergency situations. Harker consulted schematics that showed the facility's complete layout for the first time. The primary resonance chambers and the geothermal power taps are all located in the core complex. The machine's output surged again, and this time the electromagnetic field carried frequencies that made the air itself seem to vibrate. Around the chamber, abandoned equipment from the original project sparked to life, adding their own electromagnetic signatures to a field that was rapidly becoming chaotic. How long before the cooling systems fail completely? Daniel asked. At current power levels, maybe 30 minutes before thermal runaway becomes irreversible. Harker was studying readouts that painted an increasingly desperate picture. After that, the geothermal sources become unstable, and we're looking at seismic activity that could trigger earthquakes across half of Nevada. Through the observation windows, they could see that the chaos was extending beyond the underground facility. The surface above was experiencing localized weather disturbances, sudden wind shear, temperature fluctuations, and atmospheric pressure changes that suggested Project Echo's influence was affecting natural systems across a much wider area than anyone had anticipated. The scavenger crew outside, Daniel said, remembering Kavanaugh and his men, eliminated when the first power surge disrupted their vehicle's electrical systems, Harker confirmed grimly. The electromagnetic pulse effect is already manifesting within a 10-mile radius. Daniel looked around the chamber, noting that Harker's soldiers were showing signs of electromagnetic conditioning breakdown as the field fluctuations interfered with their neural programming. Men who'd been following orders without question were now showing confusion and independent thought as their artificial conditioning degraded. Can the system be shut down from the core control chambers? He asked. In theory, yes. But accessing the core chambers requires manual override of safety, systems that were designed to prevent exactly what's happening now. Harker pulled up maintenance schematics that showed access routes through ventilation shafts and service tunnels. The passages are narrow, and they'll be filled with electromagnetic radiation at levels that could be lethal. What about protective equipment? The facility has radiation suits designed for maintenance work in the core chambers, but they were never tested against electromagnetic fields at current intensity levels. The chamber shuddered again, more violently this time, as structural support strained against forces they'd never been designed to handle. The central machine was now glowing with energy that was clearly beyond safe operational parameters, and the harmonic screaming had reached levels that made normal conversation impossible. Daniel studied the maintenance schematics, noting routes that led from the main chamber down to the core control systems. The passages were indeed narrow, barely wide enough for a single person, and they descended through areas that would be flooded with electromagnetic radiation. Someone has to try, he said, raising his voice over the mechanical screaming. If the system goes into complete thermal runaway, it becomes a localized geological disaster, Evelyn finished. Seismic activity, atmospheric disruption, electromagnetic pulse effects that could cripple infrastructure across multiple states. Harker's remaining soldiers were now showing clear signs of independent thought as their electromagnetic conditioning completely broke down. Some were backing toward the chamber exits, while others seemed confused about their orders in a situation that no amount of mental programming had prepared them for. The radiation suits are in the equipment lockers near the main entry shaft, Harker said, his authority clearly diminished as his carefully planned operation dissolved into chaos around him. But I should warn you, the electromagnetic fields at core level will be at intensities that could cause permanent neural damage. Daniel was already moving toward the chamber exit, with Evelyn close behind. Whatever happened next, staying in the main chamber while Project Echo tore itself apart was guaranteed to be fatal. Where are the core control systems located relative to the maintenance access points? He called back to Harker, bottom-level central chamber. You'll know it when you see it. The electromagnetic field intensity will be strong enough to feel from 50 feet away. Harker paused, then added with something that might have been respect. If you manage to reach the core controls, the shutdown sequence is a red lever marked Emergency Power Isolation. Pulling it should cut the geothermal power feeds and allow the resonance chambers to discharge safely. Should? The system has never been shut down from full operational capacity. We're in uncharted territory as they reach the chamber exit. Daniel turned back to see Harker still working at the control console, apparently attempting to minimize the damage, even as his life's work destroyed itself around him. It was almost admirable in a terrifying way. "Colonel," Daniel called, "what really happened to my brother?" Harker looked up from the controls, his face carrying the weight of decades of classified decisions. "He died trying to prevent enemy forces from acquiring Project Echo technology. I could have provided him with information that might have kept him alive, but I was ordered to maintain operational security instead. And now we find out whether his sacrifice meant anything, or whether everything we've built here dies with us in the next 30 minutes. The facility shuddered again, more violently than before, and through the observation windows, they could see that the electromagnetic disturbances were now affecting the surface environment. The desert above was experiencing localized storms, temperature fluctuations, and atmospheric pressure changes that suggested Project Echo's influence was extending far beyond the underground complex. Time was running out, and the only way to prevent a disaster that could affect half the southwestern United States lay 300 feet underground, through passages flooded with potentially lethal electromagnetic radiation. Daniel grabbed the first radiation suit he could find and began the descent toward the core chambers, knowing that he was probably walking toward his death, but unable to think of any alternative that didn't involve watching thousands of people die from the consequences of Project Echo's catastrophic failure. The descent through the maintenance shaft was a journey through increasingly hostile electromagnetic fields that made Daniel's radiation suit feel like paper armor against cosmic forces. Each level down brought new waves of neural pressure that threatened to overwhelm his ability to think clearly, while the facility's death throes echoed through metal walls that groaned with structural stress. 300 feet underground, the core chamber opened before him like something from a fever dream. The primary resonance generators towered 40 feet above the floor, their crystalline structures pulsing with energy that turned the air itself into a visible medium. Electromagnetic fields at this intensity created aurora-like patterns that danced across every surface, beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. At the chamber's center, exactly where Harker had promised, stood a control console dominated by a red lever marked Emergency Power Isolation, the lever that could save thousands of lives if Daniel could reach it through electromagnetic fields intense, enough to cook human tissue. Each step forward required enormous effort as the fields pressed against him with almost physical weight. The radiation suit's electronics failed one by one, leaving him with no protection except determination and the knowledge that failure meant watching Project Echo trigger geological disasters across half the American Southwest. Behind him, footsteps echoed through the maintenance shaft. Evelyn had followed him down, her historian's determination proving stronger than electromagnetic interference. Together, they fought their way across the core chamber while the facility's superstructure tore itself apart around them. "The geothermal feeds," Evelyn called, pointing to massive conduits that carried molten energy from deep underground sources. "If we can't shut down the primary system, we isolate the power source," Daniel finished, understanding flooding through his mind despite the electromagnetic chaos. The emergency lever would cut the geothermal connection, but destroying the conduits would ensure Project Echo could never be reactivated. He reached the control console as Colonel Harker's voice echoed from speakers throughout the facility. "Mr. Mercer, pulling that lever will destroy 40 years of research and development. Technology that could secure American interests for generations." Daniel's hand hovered over the emergency lever, feeling the weight of decision. The technology was horrifying, but it was also undeniably powerful. In the right hands, Project Echo could prevent wars, influence hostile nations toward peaceful solutions, protect American lives through non-violent means. But the right hands didn't exist. Power this absolute would corrupt anyone who wielded it, just as it had corrupted Harker and everyone exposed to its influence for extended periods. "Some things are too dangerous to exist," he said, and pulled the lever. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Emergency systems that had been straining to contain runaway energy levels suddenly lost their primary power source, causing resonance chambers to discharge their accumulated electromagnetic energy in violent pulses that shook the facility's foundations. Daniel grabbed Evelyn's hand as the core chamber collapsed around them, emergency lighting failing as structural supports buckled under forces they'd never been designed to handle. They ran through maintenance passages that filled with debris and superheated air while Project Echo tore itself apart. With the violence of contained lightning seeking freedom, the facility's death was spectacular. Electromagnetic pulses that lit up the desert sky like artificial aurora, followed by seismic tremors as underground chambers collapsed and geothermal conduits sealed themselves under millions of tons of rock and sand. When Daniel and Evelyn finally reached the surface, dawn was breaking over a desert that looked unchanged, except for a massive crater where the facility's main entry had been. The electromagnetic storms had passed, leaving only normal Nevada wind and the vast silence of empty land. Colonel Harker's body lay beside the buried entrance, apparently crushed during the facility's collapse. His soldiers had fled when their electromagnetic conditioning failed, leaving behind only abandoned equipment and the knowledge that some secrets were better left buried. "It's over," Evelyn said, surveying the destruction that had consumed Project Echo and everyone associated with it. Daniel nodded, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders that had been there since his brother's death. Marcus had died trying to prevent this technology from falling into enemy hands, and now it was gone forever, destroyed by the same forces that had created it. They walked away from the crater together, leaving behind the ruins of humanity's attempt to control consciousness itself. Behind them, the desert began the slow process of reclaiming what had always belonged to it, burying Project Echo beneath sand and time until it became just another story that locals whispered about, but no one quite believed. Some powers were too dangerous for human hands. Some secrets were meant to stay buried. And sometimes the greatest victory was knowing when to let go of something that promised everything but would ultimately destroy anyone who tried to possess it. The desert was quiet again, as it had been before Daniel Mercer bought 63 acres of cursed land for 50 cents, as it would remain long after he was gone, keeping its secrets beneath shifting sand and endless sky.